Welcome to Series 2 of the ESG podcast. This series will focus on those who are in the throes of the everyday, the CEOs, founders and investors who are looking at the future and how best to navigate the new and changing landscape of business and its impact on all stakeholders. On today's ESG podcast, we have the privilege of interviewing Professor Simon Haslam. Simon is a chartered director and heads the leading sustainability program for the Institute of Directors. He also leads the strategic management module on Durham University's Business School's Global MBA, and he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and fellow of the Institute of Consulting. Simon's focus is on helping leaders and managers develop their leadership and strategic thinking capability. Simon's clients range across corporate, SME, public and third sectors and around the world. He is also a co-author of the book titled Strategic Decision Making. Simon, welcome to today's episode.
Rashmi, delighted to be with you.
We're really looking forward, especially with your expertise, to sort of delve a little bit more into the environmental, social governance aspects of things. So maybe we could start at the beginning. I've come across a lot of senior leadership, C-suite individuals who still don't have the full grasp of what ESG really means for the organization, and often see it's like a tick box exercise or regulation driven agenda, or in some cases just want to ignore it because they think any changes they make impacts their bottom line. How would you approach the topic with organizations on what ESG is?
I think there's two angles on this. First is the distinction between ESG and sustainability, and I would follow your sentiment, and I think unfortunately ESG has become the optics, so the way the organization presents, which is not always a good thing. Whereas sustainability, I would offer, is the fundamental philosophy. So you can have an organization who's putting a lot of energy into its optics, the way it presents, without addressing the way it conducts its business. So I think that distinction is an important one to recognize. And I would really advocate that every organization has what one of my clients has branded a sustainability school, that everybody through the organization, top down, has an immersion in what sustainability is about, to try and challenge some of these myths and misconceptions. And if that is successful, then that misinterpretation is less likely to occur.
So it's the myths that people have, and it's the old school thinking of we always make things worse in our heads because we don't have all the full facts, actually, all the data before we make that decision of should we even try something.
And I think so. I think in terms of we're very familiar with the phrase "what gets measured gets done," and with the pressure of external scrutiny, then an over-reliance on the optics is just driving some very non-laudable behaviors. So partial disclosures, putting boundaries around business models to try and make the ESG data look particularly attractive, and we're not addressing anything. And so there is that danger of the current fashion for ESG and regulation and reporting.
So hopefully companies will move away from, some of the companies will move away from it being a fad, which is what some of them think it is. Yeah. So if they're on board and they think, okay, let's embrace ESG and what it really stands for, and you know, this is long-term sustainability here that we're talking about, how does the practice of good governance and strategy and long-term sustainability sit together?
You and I have worked together before, and you know where I stand on this one. And I think in terms of these two subjects need to go hand in hand. But the backstory doesn't serve well, because organizations, when we came into governance in the corporate sector, it was mainly about compliance conformance, which is incredibly important, as we know. But it's not the only part of governance. So as well as the compliance aspect, conformance aspect, there is the duty of anybody in a governance role to consider the future of the organization. And it's that shift in thinking that not every board of directors, not every senior leadership team gets. So you would hope in a contemporary organization that governance would wholeheartedly embrace strategy, because that's about the future of the enterprise. And I think it's quite interesting when we think about where the future of the enterprise is going. The shift from neoliberalism and shareholder capitalism to more enlightened stakeholder capitalism is the journey we are, for the most part, on. And when we think about strategy going forward, we're looking for organizations that are financially resilient in an ever difficult world, but also are doing so in a way that is appropriate to the stakeholders, to the society at large, and also to the planet. So in summary, because governance started out from the compliance perspective, some organizations are very much playing catch up to embrace strategy with governance. And strategy itself is changing because of the nature changer of the role of the organization in society and in the planet.
That's actually really interesting, because you've hit on a couple of key points there. One is the changing nature of how corporates are having to view how they govern things, from moving that focus, which is on one stakeholder, the shareholder, and just purely adhering to what they want and their needs and their requirements or demands, to who are all our stakeholders, and they all have individual needs and demands, and they all vary from one another. So initially it's almost jumping into the cold water and taking that hit, right, where you're like, this is just maybe too much and overwhelming and we can't do it, let's just focus. And the default is to want to just go back to shareholder management. But actually, if you stay there for a little while, you actually understand how to manage that situation. And if you using the swimming analogy, you'll start swimming quite comfortably. But it just takes that moment and understanding and guidance, external guidance, getting people in to help you through that strategic change and that vision, really.
I agree with you, and I think I saw your flinch of breath as you entered the water there. It can be challenging for a lot of boards, a lot of directors, a lot of senior leaders. Yes.
Yeah. So that's, having said that, that's a really interesting point that we were making, because I firmly believe when we are mapping our stakeholders, it's quite critical to understand where the stakeholders all sit. And I always see it as rings of trees. So, we'll have the immediate ring, which is, yes, your shareholders, but your employees. Then we have our supply chain. Okay. And then we need to start adding the external rings a little bit more, which we're still impacting either directly or indirectly as a corporate. And it was an interesting case around, I talked about it on LinkedIn, and it's around Pablo Escobar. So his name is associated with drug cartels in Colombia, and there was a court case where his brother has released a token around using the name, and the EU intellectual property courts rejected the use. This has taken 4 years to allow that company to use that name because of the public interest for the Spanish, because it was still too close to the death of Pablo Escobar. Now that's interesting because it comes under the guise legally of public interest. But to me, from a corporate perspective as well, if I was wearing that hat, actually it's your stakeholders. You should have realized maybe that this name still has an impact. But some people say, well, that's just too wide to think about. It's just a public interest. But for me, I can see there's a change slightly. If you use the word stakeholder in a sense of who do I impact? Who is actually going to be impacted by my organization's actions. I mean, how do you map stakeholders and then work that into your strategy?
I like your rings of trees. I think it's a very sensible way of looking at stakeholders. And a definition of an organization has been offered as a combination of stakeholder interests. So that which defines an organization is stakeholders looking for sufficient similarity. But I think in terms of stakeholder mapping, what we're recognizing is organizations face broader scrutiny. So the radar we would use to capture the stakeholders needs to be stronger and have a greater breadth to it. And it shifts away from this idea of shareholder primacy. And what it then means is when we deal with multiple vantage points, perspectives, different stakeholders, we are unlikely to find a solution that ticks everybody's boxes simultaneously. The management researchers refer to this as a wicked problem, so a problem without straightforward resolution. And it just reminds us that contemporary organizations is about leading in complexity. And I think what can get in the way is when we are generally multi-stakeholder and we are embracing different perspectives, the likelihood of finding an ideal solution is probably zero, but we don't need that. We just need a solution that is good enough. So this idea of experimentation and being prepared to go with things rather than to pursue perfection, because in complexity, perfection is probably too big an ask. And it encourages with sustainability and ESG is to make judgments based upon reasoned insight, incomplete pictures, and hope that the steps we take move us forward, but also to realize the steps that we take might not be in themselves 100% effective. I mean, one example would be maybe 5-10 years ago, there's a big energy around retailers doing bags for life. And it was considered to be a good environmental response to the single-use plastic bag. Now, it is only now that we're able to have the data and look back, we realize the bag for life wasn't maybe that bright a move, because the consumption of plastic in a typical bag for life is a lot higher than a single-use bag. A lot of people's single-use bags were multiple use anyway. So the multiplier of use on a bag for life to have a genuine positive impact on the planet was a lot higher than people envisaged to start with. It doesn't mean to say we got it wrong at the beginning. What we did was make a reasoned view forward to enable us to take a step in the right direction and to create more data. And the messier your stakeholder map becomes, the harder that journey then becomes.
And I think it's important as well, using that example with the bag for life, is once you have got the data, you need to change though if you know it's not working, as opposed to sitting in a comfortable position and saying, well, we're selling a product still, and we'll change when something better comes along. You know, I think there's a duty and an obligation to try and find what can be an alternative.
Oh, there absolutely is. And I think dealing with complexity, the three things to do are probe, have a go at something, sense, determine how that something has played out, and then respond accordingly. So the point you make about it is incumbent upon leadership to have that mindset to try things out and to be prepared to change direction based on what they have then learned is close to how we can make organizations continually relevant in an increasing complex world.
Absolutely. And that's quite, it's quite a lot for businesses to sometimes initially take on, but actually it's something we learn as children, isn't it? We have to try and experiment. Otherwise, we're not going to know what works for us or not. It's almost like play.
I agree.
In that way. But interestingly, then if the leadership have made this decision to become more sustainable moving forward and taking into consideration stakeholders, including the environment, there can be, because they're very focused on the future, there can be a conflict that arises between the leadership and the management teams, where management's perspective is based on, well, we only have these resources available to us. And so their mindset isn't quite necessarily built into the future because they have to focus on the here and now. So when the organization is trying to change from the top, the culture around it and the attitude takes time to change. So there can be a bit of a conflict and a struggle. What advice would you offer in those type of situations?
I think there are three things. Firstly, to come back to the comment about sustainability school, enabling people in the organization at all levels and with all areas of interest to consider the implications of an organization which is unsustainable and the duty of an organization as a prime mover in society to do the right thing by sustainability. So I think there's work that can be done to socialize ESG and sustainability, number one. Number two, we would all appreciate that diversity tends to be a very good thing for organizations who have the mechanisms to embrace what diversity means for different processes, different styles, different decision making, and the accommodation of people who are different. But when we look at the data, the most important diversity you can do from an ESG sustainability point of view is intergenerational. Now, the problem for organizations is the typical model is we started an organization at a modest level with tender years. And as our careers progress, we rise up the ladder. And that is commensurate with us getting older as well. So when you look at the age distribution between the top and bottom of an organization, unsurprisingly, the people at the top tend to be older than the people at the bottom. And now we know that intergenerational diversity is the most powerful form of diversity you can bring in to positively affect sustainability and ESG. We have to figure out mechanisms to positively change and enhance the voice of younger people at the top of organizations. Now, that can be done. I've got various clients doing it in various different ways. So there are solutions out there, but it's that mindset to say, yeah, this is important, therefore we change. And the third aspect is the organization being honest about its business model. The late Clay Christensen, when he would be looking at organizations strategically, he would say that every incumbent in a sector is cursed. And their curse is self-inflicted because of the path dependency we have created, our sunk cost, our curated cultures. We've become embedded and therefore inflexible. But this third part is the degree to which the organization will genuinely unpick its business model and move towards more circular economy ideals, where any resource we use is replenishable, the energy is from sustainable sources, and we don't drive the mantra of consumerism. So we are designing services or we're designing products that are kept at their maximum value for as long as possible. And the term waste is completely eradicated from how we do. And that's a major shift. There are organizations starting to do this. But that would be the third dimension, that if we genuinely embrace circular economy principles, then we can hold a really strong mirror up to the way we do things around here, the business models that might have been appropriate to the context 20 odd years ago, but don't necessarily look that pretty going forwards. So that would be my view.
I think you're absolutely right about especially around point 3, because we do get stuck, especially when we come around sunken costs, because we've put so much time and effort into it, that we do. It's very hard mentally to move. It's not, sorry. It's not necessarily the inability for the business to move. It's the mental shift that the leadership has to have initially to create a little bit of that momentum. And I think and that's where the benefit comes from when you mentioned in point 2 the intergenerational, because that then helps with that creativity, that thought process, the thinking about the future as well, because how it impacts the younger generation. And also it's their experience, because now experience, how we classify it, is so different. It isn't just how many years we've done it in industry, because the experience is technology as well. And the younger generation have more experience in that field, so we'll see things completely differently. Which brings us into the whole area of technology, which is absolutely a vast topic. But without a shadow of doubt, I think tech is changing the landscape. It's not just about business and society, but the consequences of technology around business and society, and the environment. So it's changing everybody's lives. But how important is it for large tech companies to consider the implementation of a good strategic approach to ESG, bearing in mind there are advantages, for instance, around like ChatGPT, where they can help improve things, but then one prompt uses 4 servers, and that effect on the environment can be huge. What do you think?
I think there's a duty on any organisation to consider its societal and planetary impact, and to just think about whether what it is doing, it is wholesome, it is valuable. And so you cite tech companies and the rise of generative AI as a consumer of energy. Fair enough. But it's just not the tech companies. I think all organizations, number one, technology is the biggest driver of change. So all organizations need to be technologically capable and technologically literate, top level down. And it is then that added layer onto how we do what we do in terms of running a sustainable organization. I think in terms of the benefits of technology would be to help with our ESG dashboards. So the transmission of information, the challenge around that is when you look at ESG and the data we need, it tends not to be all in one place in an organization. So there's a little bit of stringing it all together to enable the technological pipelines to furnish dashboards and to make information transparent, but just make sure that information is robust before it gets to become transparent. And the other is the value of technology in being an enabler of good circular economy practices. And so the ability of supply chains to link together, to understand the footprint and almost the identity of each part of that value creation. So there are so many benefits of using technology to the benefit of where organizations are going. As you say, there will be some costs, and I'm hoping that every organization, including the tech giants, are mindful of the costs and are weighing those up in relation to the benefits.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. I really appreciate you coming on to the episode today. It's been absolutely a great pieces of wisdoms that you've given us, with leaving us with so much to think about in terms of the long-term sustainability, looking at how we're actually gathering our information and creating our own database, to understand that ESG is not a fad and not of the moment, but it is something that we have a duty to think about in terms of the future, and move away a little more from just the compliance and the performance of things. And it's our duty as well just to really, like you said, probe, play, and then respond once we've got the data. And embracing diversity, particularly with intergenerational, is actually going to help us long term to create a better agenda for our ESG and make us all very sustainable. But before I go, Simon, I always ask my guests for a piece of wisdom to share with our listeners, and B, either a book, musician, or artist that they would recommend to our listeners, and why.
Okay, let me start with the wisdom. And this is not me, this is something that came my way. And it relates to how organizations might reshape the world. And a few years ago, I would naively believe that the work of organizations like Patagonia could be relatively well replicated and all organizations would follow. And the more I've gone into this, the more I appreciate is the role of organizations like Patagonia is to be leaders and set the standard. But there is a shift in the way that other organizations will need to respond. So here's the wisdom. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so I would really hope that the implications of organizations working beyond their own boundary, working collaboratively across sector, that means working with people you might consider to be competitors, and working with the supply chain. So rather than see the supply chain as either an upstream or downstream to you, you are embracing it as part of you. And in that way, the corporate body can have a really positive influence in reshaping entire supply chains, livelihoods, and sectors. So I think we're in a situation where we are needing to go far. Therefore, we are needing to go together. Therefore, we are needing to be more collaborative in the way we embrace sustainability. So that's the wisdom one.
I would love to use that, by the way, on retail, especially with what you talked about earlier about, removing waste and making products for long-term sustainability. That would be brilliant for retail, wouldn't it? What you just said.
Well, it totally would. I mean, I did a little bit of looking into the clothing company Barbour, and would be very familiar with the iconic Barbour jacket and Barbour clothing. And okay, I'm not holding Barbour up as a paragon of virtue, but what I will draw attention to is the organization's focus on supply chain and focus across on pan-industry initiatives to enable the entire sector to help raise its game. So absolutely right, with you all the way on the retail one.
Yeah. And then
the book,
the last one. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So he's going in front of camera. I don't know whether you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. The Best of Joy.
Lovely. The Book of Joy. Thank you. You recognise.
Yeah.
So this came my way from my sister as a birthday present, and the reason for commending it is I think we've got some challenging and interesting times ahead, and I would hope that we get the opportunity to do a little bit of a reset individually, and to reconnect with things which are perhaps more straightforward and simple going forward. So it is offered as a fresh perspective underpinned by some well-established wisdom, which I reckon is potentially benefits us all from a resurfacing. So the Book of Joy, there we are, Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we had the wonderful Professor Simon Haslam today on the ESG podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we will be coming back with our next episode shortly. Thanks for listening. I've been Rashmi Dubé, Litigation and ESG Partner with Gunnar Cook, and you've been listening to the ESG podcast. Contact me at rashmi.dube@gunnercook.com, link in with me, or follow me on X and Instagram. On X is @Rashmi Dubé, and my handle is rashmi.dube on Instagram. If you would like to understand the path you are taking as a director or the company on how to improve company performance from the practice of good governance and avoid litigation, or at least reduce the risk, drop me a note. Thanks for listening to the ESG podcast with Gunnar Cook. See you next time.